Hello everyone, welcome to Majoring the Minors, a weekly series where we cover the events in the North American Academy scene. Most of you guys know the gist at this point, so I'll keep the introduction brief since we have a lot of ground to cover this episode. The third week of Academy was relatively uneventful, and most of the results went the way we expected, but this week we're going to be doing something completely different. Instead, we're going to be investigating an event that has far-reaching implications on NA Academy and LCS as a whole. We are going to be analyzing the ongoing explosion that is Immortals, specifically their Academy roster, and why we are here today, where 3 players who were in Academy last split are currently competing in LCS, but weren't even replacing the weakest links on Immortals' LCS roster. We need to start from the very beginning, and that beginning is the Optic Academy roster of which the Immortals Academy roster spawned from. Optic Academy was extremely unremarkable, even for an Academy team. Out of the 4 Academy splits they played in, they never reached playoffs a single time. There was only one player that played on Optic Academy that ever reached a starting position in LCS, which was Dokla. I'm not going to go in depth with Dokla because his reputation precedes him, and it would make me feel bad if I had to harp on his poor performance in LCS. In short, Optic Academy was a notoriously bad place for talent to develop. That's not a slight against the coaching staff themselves, but more so the talent scouting, and likely the lack of upwards mobility that's typically experienced by Academy players. In 2020, Optic sold their LCS spot to Immortals, which necessitated Immortals filling out an Academy roster. They retained Alorum and Gate from Optic, picked up Potluck for the jungle from a coaching position in Golden Guardians, mid laner Insanity from Team Liquid Academy, and Apollo from Echo Fox, which was a strange pickup since Apollo seems like one of the better players in that roster. Additionally, Immortals Academy retained most of the same staff that Optic Academy had employed. Each of these players played in 2020 Spring Academy, with the only movement being the promotion of Apollo to the main roster, which was puzzling because Altic had been playing quite well in LCS. While Apollo would perform even better than Altic in LCS, something strange happened to Immortals Academy. The team was just 6-4, just coming off a 0-2 Week 5 when the swap occurred. These losses were to Cloud9 and Dignitas, both teams who were super high in the standings and had extremely promising rosters, so while it was rough, it wasn't the most outlandish thing ever. But then, Immortals Academy started to lose. And then they lost more. After Altec's substitution, Immortals Academy only ever picked up one win in the final 4 weeks, from 6-4 to a 7-11 record. It's these 4 weeks that we will be focusing on. We will be comparing the team's performance before and after the substitution in order to find clues that led to the downfall of Immortals Academy and what this means going forward for the organization. Since Wikipedia does not record statistics week by week, I watched each game for Immortals Academy in the 2020 Spring Split and recorded the team statistics and separated them from before Week 6 and after Week 6. What I found was very unexpected, because Immortals Academy is a team unlike any other in North America. Usually, I would save something like draft for the end of the episode, but I can't this week for a very apparent reason. Immortals Academy didn't draft like any other team with Coobs. Their unique champion picks per position were either number 1 or number 2 throughout the split, other than in jungle. They played picks no one else was playing at the time, and they did flexes that no one else did. I'm someone who's pretty well known for being critical of ego drafting, which is currently dominating both the North American and European amateur scene, where coaches will only pick champions that both fit together and counter the enemy.
Das ist einfach, weil die beiden noch ein bisschen mehr Appeal gegeben hätten als Nautilus. Im Gegensatz, oder sowas.
Ist das ein Kartus ADC?
Ja. Ich mein letzte...
Struggle
Skip
with.
through the rest of the
Ow.
draft.
We've gotten a lot of picks already through. Twisted Fate mid. I'm in.
Initially, Coobs' drafts may have appeared to be in this style, but it quickly becomes apparent that there's something much deeper at play when Immortals players show proficiency in the execution of their strange compositions. This multi-tooled implementation of champion picks is completely unrivaled in North American drafts, even by championship rosters. While there are some compositions that Immortals have drafted that are objectively bad, these are clearly in the minority, and Coobs overall did an excellent job at using his player's entire champion pool to his advantage, which is something that a lot of coaches, even good ones, neglect frequently. Coobs didn't do this to flex on the puny brain coaches. He did this in order to give his team the best odds of winning, which is what a draft should be. Syndra flexes, 3-way Pantheon flexes, Kled flexes, Nocturne flexes, Diana flexes, Set flexes, Lucian flexes, Cassiopeia flexes are just a few, and trust me, there are many more that I missed out on. Coobs did a great job at really pushing his players to the limit. As the split went on, teams did catch on to this trend and drafted better around them. But an excellent example of a draft that just crushes the enemy is in the final win for IMT, where Immortals played Golden Guardians. There were no flexes in this draft, but even just looking at these drafts, it becomes very apparent very quickly that Immortals is at a massive advantage from the second they load in. How does Golden Guardians get onto Zoe? Qiyana has a favorable matchup in lane, but Immortals' disruptive and tanky frontline completely stonewalls the frontline of Golden Guardians. Xayah and Zoe are both champions extremely hard to lock down and are capable of operating from a variety of ranges, making full use of the space that their frontline creates. Immortals flub the early and mid game pretty hard, but realistically these games are absurdly hard for Golden Guardians to win. Immortals have a nearly perfect draft, and try as they might, not even they can lose with it. Starting in the top lane is a Lorem, who best can be described as anti-Lorlo. I talked very briefly about Lorlo in the last video, and how his statistics were indicative of his role in the team being different than a conventional side-laning top laner. While Lorlo has the highest kill participation percentage and the lowest CS per minute out of any top laner, a Lorem has the lowest kill participation percentage and the highest CS per minute out of any top laner. A Lorem is a curious case, however, since his champion picks are unlike any other top laner in Academy. Nocturne, Pantheon, Urgot, and Yorick are his highest played. No other player picked Nocturne, Urgot, or Yorick once the entire split, and Alorem even had the former two champions banned against him. Before week 6, while Alorem had a low kill participation percentage relative to other top laners, it was actually higher relative to his statistics later in the split. Instead of being last, he was more around 8th, and while his kill share was middling, he actually held the second highest gold share on his team at 22.2%. Alorem was primarily a side lane threat for Immortals, and supplemented Gate's primary engage with secondary engage from his Pantheon or Nocturne. Alorem is primarily known in the community for his tank play, and while he's good at tanks, it's clear from watching him he's actually a really good weak side carry player too. That may sound weird in 2020, especially in this meta where the dichotomy is strong side carry, weak side tank, but think about it this way. Alorem is the type of person who would probably pick Kayle into Ornn top, knowing full well that it's unlikely that he'd be the focus of his own jungler's resources. Now imagine that instead of Kayle, it's Urgot or Nocturne. Much different, but Alorem gets his resources by farming and effective rotations, instead of from jungle pressure like other carry top players. A big negative that comes with this is that it's prone to causing imbalanced compositions, which is certainly something that Immortals suffered from later in the season. Particularly after week 6, Alorem began to do things like try to counter Gangplank with Yorick, which does make some sense on paper and fits in perfectly with Alorem's weak side carry playstyle. The problem is, Gangplank has global pressure and very good wave clear, which stonewalls Yorick's push in the late game, and while Yorick does threaten Gangplank in the 1v1 both in laning phase and in the late game side lane, it's ultimately meaningless and Immortals lost both games. Alorem was mostly the same player after the swap, surprise surprise an 80 carry swap doesn't affect top lane much, but the other teams in the league did start to do a better job of punishing Alorem in the early game, and since he was primarily a weak side player, this led to him falling behind from early game ganks. In short, Alorem's not much of a team fighter, he's a side lane carry. Honestly, there is one player who strikes me as being nearly identical to Alorem, and that would actually be Excel's Kryze. When Kryze was on Unicorns of Love, he was very well known for being a weak side carry player that would prefer a side lane throughout the mid to late game. While I do think Kryze is ultimately a better player and has a pull that more closely resembles the archetypal weak side carry role, Alorem is undoubtedly a player who brings something very different to North American top lane. Overall, I actually think Alorem is a very sophisticated player with a different way of playing top lane relative to the rest of North America. However, Alorem does need to shore up his weaknesses in the early laning phase, and recognize his susceptibility to early game jungle aggression on his picks, especially because these matchups are naturally volatile. Since his promotion to LCS, people have begun to take notice in Potluck, and for good reason too. Potluck was actually quite good in Academy. He wasn't a top 3 jungler, but he was likely somewhere in the top half, maybe 6th at worst. Potluck's picks relative to the rest of IMT were much more conventional. He particularly specialized in early game junglers like Rek'Sai, Lee Sin, and Elise. Jungle meta in Spring was relatively early game oriented, so these picks are nothing new. But Potluck's neutral control was definitely on the upside relative to the other teams. A consistent first dragon percentage, first turret percentage, and only a slight decrease on the first herald and the gold delta at 15 compared to the first 6 and last 3 weeks. These statistics are actually really good, but Immortals had a repeated issue transitioning these good early games into stable mid games, and there's a very simple reason why that is. Potluck had the highest kill share out of all of the junglers in the 2020 Academy Spring split. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, carry junglers are common anywhere you look, and in a team like Immortals Academy, a carry jungler can thrive with the pieces around him. However, if you think back to the episode about North American rookies, Potluck found himself in a situation extremely similar that Tomo did early in the currently ongoing summer split. Potluck lacks the veterancy to close out games single-handedly, and he isn't picking champions to further push his leads in the late game. This wasn't an issue at all early in the split, for reasons we will cover later, but after week 6, this became extremely apparent. This was exacerbated by the fact that Potluck's gold share only increased as the split went on, with very little return in regards to mid-game threat. For reference, in the first 5 weeks of Academy, Potluck had a gold share of 18.5%, which would place him relatively high, but only at 5th overall. However, in the last 4 weeks, Potluck had a gold share of 19.22%, which may seem small at only a 0.72% increase, but this small change resulted in him being the highest gold share jungler in the last 3 weeks. Combined with his early game champion pool, it becomes increasingly apparent why Immortals had a difficult time closing out games. A lot of their gold was simply placed on a non-skilling threat. Potluck was middling in other statistics. His KD was right in the middle, his CS per minute was average, his kill participation percentage was consistently average and unchanging throughout the substitution. But a statistic that further exemplifies this change is his CS delta at 15. While Potluck had a CS delta at 15 of +3 before the substitution, Potluck had a CS delta at 15 of -4 after the substitution. This change is minuscule, but when you evaluate this change in the context that Potluck's gold share actually increased after the substitution, it becomes apparent that Potluck's additional gold share is not being self-generated, it's coming from the sacrifices of his teammates. Potluck failing to carry with his relatively large gold share is not a slight against Potluck, nor is it entirely his fault. Rather, it's symptomatic of Immortals' problems in a wider context. Immortals is doing a poor job at putting gold on people who are capable of carrying, or picking champions in positions that they plan to have carry the game. It's very clear that Potluck's early games are good, and Potluck actually showed a lot of progression throughout the split in this respect. His early games only got better and better as the weeks went on. As a side note, I really think picks like Graves could let Potluck shine. His game against FlyQuest and LCS helped show that, where he performed admirably even though his team struggled. Overall, Potluck needs to be in the correct environment in order for him to succeed. He cannot be placed into a team where he must be the one carrying without the necessary tools to do so. Immortals' mid laner, Insanity, is something different entirely. There is a term I use for players like Insanity, and that would be a junk player. If you're familiar with baseball terminology, this term is self-explanatory. If you're not, a junk player is a player with a wide champion pool and is comfortable on a variety of off-meta matchups in order to secure an advantage in lane. Think about players like Keen or Doinby, and you'll understand perfectly what I'm talking about. These players are actually extremely valuable in the regards that junk players will lend you a large amount of flexibility in your draft, both in the matchup you give them and in your overall composition. One example is in Immortals' game against Cloud9 in the first round robin of the Academy split. Cloud9 sets up for a Yasuo pick by banning Pantheon, an extremely hard matchup for Yasuo. Despite this, Insanity doesn't need Pantheon to counter Yasuo. He knows how to play Kled mid lane, and Immortals utilizes Apollo's strong Syndra in order to execute a flex to deliver 2 favorable matchups for IMT. Additionally, Kled synergizes with Alorim's Nocturne top lane better than a pick like Renekton would, and Kled delivers a better mid-jungle 2v2 than Pantheon with Lee Sin by virtue of Kled's much higher mobility. Most teams would not be capable of flexing Syndra into the bottom lane, or at best they would simply take a pick like Renekton into the Yasuo mid lane. But Insanity's large champion pool allows Immortals to take a truly perfect pick in order to synergize with the team and counter the enemy, without compromising on Insanity's individual performance. A wide champion pool is a big advantage for Insanity, but while this split he's been doing his best to reinvent himself as a more conventional mid laner, during spring and in splits prior, he's certainly been much more of a teacher ma. His statistics tell us he's not a good laner, judging by his poor CS delta at 15 and KDA, but by looking at his gameplay, it actually turns out that he's not a laner at all. Insanity had the second highest kill participation percentage out of all of the starting mid laners in spring, and in the final 3 weeks, he actually had the highest. However, he had the lowest CS per minute out of all of the starting mid laners, and consistently had the lowest gold share throughout the split. While it may seem like Insanity is a lost cause, this has actually clearly been changing in summer, where on picks like Azir, his gold share percentage has been increasing while his kill participation percentage is remaining high. It's apparent that Insanity is actually closer to Doinby than T-Sherma in this respect. He doesn't avoid lane because he needs to, he avoids lane because he believes, or perhaps more accurately, believed that it was the best way to win the game at the time. This lack of firepower from the mid lane was exacerbated in the later weeks, where the absence of a carry threat created a weakness in Immortals Academy. The team would flounder on picks like Morgana, Set, and Karma in the mid lane, and this was felt in teamfights around mid-game objectives, where the lack of damage severely hurt Immortals. I think this change of style for Insanity is very welcome this split. Insanity is actually very talented on these strange picks, but he's currently showing that he can also play picks like Azir, which are mid lane mainstays. Overall, while his statistics may not be the best, it's very apparent that Insanity is a flexible piece, and a large downfall for Immortals' mid-jungle was the fact that neither of them held a player who was on a true carry pick. Insanity, on the few times he did play an actual carry, his Rumble, Victor, Zoe, and Syndra each looked good. Pollock and Insanity did work well together, but the lack of a good gold recipient ultimately would doom Immortals each game. I would have liked to see Immortals change their drafts later in the season in order to put Insanity on a true carry. But this leads us to the ultimate problem with Immortals, the lack of a carry threat. Neither Apollo nor Altec are known for being premier carry threats, but statistics do paint a different story. For ADC, I will segment this part into two parts, since I'm analyzing two completely different players and their roles within the team. While Apollo was known as a secondary carry throughout his tenure in LCS, Apollo would absolutely curb stomp the young Academy talent. Throughout the games Apollo played in Academy, the only losses that Apollo faced were to Cloud9 King, FlyQuest Mash, Dignitas Phoenix, and Team Liquid Tactical. Each of these players were very good AD carries for Academy, but these defeats were usually off of the back of early game misexecution and not necessarily attributable to poor performance by Apollo. As a matter of fact, Apollo was actually the best AD carry in Academy during his tenure by far. His KDA was staggering in comparison to the rest of the Academy ADCs. He had the highest kill participation percentage relative to all other Academy AD carries, but he also had the second lowest kill share out of all of the starting ADCs, combined with only having the fourth highest gold share of Academy ADCs. This means that a lot of Apollo's advantages are actually being self-generated as opposed to being granted to him by his team. Beyond his great statistics, Apollo as ADC gave Potluck a clear lane to play around in the early game, and this pressure around bottom lane was very well received and resulted in a very clear way of playing the game. Aloran would pick a weak side carry like Nocturne or Urgot in the top lane, and win lane while simultaneously scaling. Potluck would pick an early game jungler like Rek'Sai or Lee Sin and look to dominate the mid jungle 2v2 and impact bottom lane early with Insanity on a favorable matchup. Apollo would convert this gold lead into a large teamfight advantage, and would ultimately carry the game by utilizing the early game advantages awarded to him by Potluck and Insanity. This strategy would work extremely well, as showcased in Immortals vs 100 Thieves in Week 3 of Academy. Potluck counters an early game gank from Contracts, and an excellent teleport from Aloran lends an early game advantage to Immortals' bottom lane. From there, Apollo uses his advantage by rotating around the map to neutral waves. By 15 minutes, Immortals has a gold lead of over 3,000, with Apollo having a 100% kill participation percentage. From here, the game is smooth sailing, and while Apollo doesn't end the game with a 100% kill participation percentage, it's very apparent that the advantages generated early for Immortals primarily came from bottom side, and specifically Apollo's mechanical and macro play. After Week 5, Immortals lost their primary carry in Apollo. Theoretically, Altec should be comparable in skill level, but this was far from reality. Compared to all starting ADCs, Altec had the lowest KDA and the second lowest kill participation percentage. With Altec's substitution, Potluck had a much harder time identifying lanes to play around. One particular game which shows this lack of direction from Immortals is Immortals vs Dignitas in Week 9. Ultimately, this game would decide the fate of Immortals Academy. If they lose here, they're out of playoffs entirely. I'm not going to commentate over this clip, and you will understand why. But believe me when I say that this clip is pretty indicative of Altec's performance in Academy.
Next one, because we know Immortal is going to be the one who's going to try and jump on us in just a couple of moments. A teleport coming out.
Oh, wow. Oh, the double body slam. That's not what you want to see. Fate's Call is going to be...
There's a topic the League community doesn't really acknowledge when talking about Academy, and one that is only really discussed by former Academy players themselves. And that's the role that confidence plays in performance. There is zero doubt in my mind that Altec's poor performance in Academy was largely a consequence of his lack of motivation due to him being demoted in the first place. This is exacerbated by the fact that it was abundantly apparent that the issue with Immortals' LCS roster was not Altec. There is a very specific reason I bring this up, even though it may appear like a tangential rant. By Immortals using their Academy roster as a dumping ground, they irreversibly impacted the development and the growth of their rookie talent. That's not to say that Immortals should have gotten a different AD carry for Academy and dumped Altec on the bench, or that they shouldn't have moved Apollo up to LCS, but the way they went around the situation was undeniably poor. I understand that winning Academy or even placing well is irrelevant for organizations, but as a player in Academy, the only way you will ever start in LCS is by winning Academy. Meanwhile, players like Alltech, who just went 1-7 in Academy with the worst statistics out of any AD carry in Academy, gets to start on an LCS team. This is not Alltech's fault, at least not directly, but I will use this point to illustrate an overarching issue with Academy. The goal of Academy should be to win, but that does not mean that players who are not in winning teams should be completely ignored. Nor should an organization simply use their Academy spots as a bench like Immortals did, because inevitably you're self-sabotaging the players you are supposedly aiming to develop by sticking them with a player who has zero motivation by account of you demoting them in the first place. What's the solution to this? Well, that's nebulous and I don't have an answer right away. But I do feel strongly that there is one, even if it's just making it apparent that Alltech would actually need to perform well in Academy in order to regain his LCS spot. I know people will use the carrot part of the carrot and stick analogy, but I'm much more partial to the stick part myself. Players need to be told that slacking off in Academy is not tolerable. That being said, I disagree with the premise of benching Alltech at all in this scenario. Clearly Ica should have been the one benched, or Apollo, who was clearly the better AD carry all along, should have just started. But experienced players using Academy as a vacation is what's hurting the growth of talent in Academy. It's not players like Zion Spartan or Damonte or Apollo smurfing through Academy. It's the fact that upward mobility for actual young players in Academy is curtailed by LCS teams using their Academy spots like a bench for players who are basically waiting for LCS and only playing Academy out of obligation, and clearly showing no effort while doing so. Finally, we have Gate. If you can't tell, the structure of this video was supposed to climax with the ADC role, but there's still Gate to talk about. Gate was promoted to LCS this season, much to the surprise of everyone, including me. Honestly, I'm sorry guys, but he's really unremarkable. He has a middling KDA and kill participation percentage, and his laning phase, which is the most important part of support, was just okay. There is one thing that's actually really hilarious though. Gate has the most extreme win rates on every single champion he picked in spring. On Braum, Rakan, and Leona, he has a 100% win rate. On each other champion, he has a 0% win rate. This doesn't necessarily lend us any new information that's particularly relevant, but I will step forward and say Gate's Rakan is actually unironically really good. I know that's a strange aspect for me to hone in on, but while Zaire Rakan is a trademark Apollo Hakuho favorite of mine, Gate does perform a remarkable Hakuho impersonation on the pick. In fact, Rakan was the pick that Gate was on when Immortals won their singular game with Alltech, and Gate looked really good in that game too. Otherwise, I have nothing to say about Gate. He's mediocre for Academy. Usually, I would spot out a few things for players to improve on individually as a conclusion, but I think Gate mostly suffers from a champion pool issue more than anything, and I do think that's a very large reason why his win rates are clearly divided on champions like this. I'm not saying that Immortals would win 100% of games if Gate was on these champions, only that his performance on these champions are consistently good, and his performance when not on these champions is consistently bad. Furthermore, I'm pretty sure that there's apparent synergy issues between Gate and Alltech, judging by how they play, or maybe Apollo is some sort of super ADC that can magically synergize with any support. Maybe it's a little bit of both, but Gate looked way worse individually when Alltech was playing as opposed to when Apollo was playing, and people who only watched Gate with Alltech immediately got the impression that Gate was an awful support. That's not true. Gate is a mediocre support. It's a strange distinction to make, and I know defending Gate is probably the strangest hill to die on ever, but I do genuinely think that Gate has his place in Academy as a person who's capable of helping develop talent. In conclusion, what happened to Immortals Academy? A team that was in perfect trajectory for playoffs, who only needed to win 3 games in their last 8 in order to qualify? Well, bad management doomed their roster by substituting in a low-motivation player, which indirectly harmed the career of the less developed Academy players. If it's not apparent at this point, I'm using the topical nature of Immortals in order to talk about them and use them as an allegory towards the league. Immortals Academy is a microcosm of North American Academy, in fact. Good talent and even good coaches are being held back, and their development is being stifled by management that does not care about Academy. Right now, it's 2 AM on a Sunday, and a few hours ago, an Immortals LCS roster of Alorum, Xmithy, Insanity, Apollo, and Hakuho just won their first LCS game against Golden Guardians, much to the surprise of anyone who doesn't watch Academy. I don't base my judgment of these players based on their LCS results. Hell, I predicted they'd win before they even stepped on stage because I already spent the days prior watching each Immortals Academy spring game. But ultimately, it only demonstrates what I'm trying to talk about. There is talent tied up in Academy, and a lot of it too. The only thing that's stopping it from flourishing is the inhospitable environment that is Academy, which is something I'm trying to see change by making the series in the first place, and someday I'd like to help make that change personally. Thanks for watching. I know this is a lot different from my other content, but I really did need to make this video. I'll be back next week with a video that's more in line with my last 2 episodes. I'll see you then.